or for Hashem, and that's just totally out of the way. So just putting that disclaimer on the front of what we have to say. We'll get into the main part of the message at this time. The ancient Canaanites were blacks, were black people. Now the key and the operative word here is were, not is and not are. The key and operative word is were, and that handful or 100 or a little more of black people within that region of the world who claim or who are called or who have settled to calling themselves Canaanites being the exception to the rule. When we say that the Canaanites, the ancient Canaanites, and qualify that the ancient Canaanites were black people, were. The key operative word there is were, as in past tense. They were. But we know this for a fact. We know that the Gentiles, the nations, that the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs and writers, and from the understanding of our ancient scriptures, as well as the archaeology and the evidence that is here, including the scientific and genetical evidence as well, but someone dismissed that. You understand? We will begin with the other evidence that we have, and then it'll make more sense which genealogical DNA evidence to include. I agree with you, not all the DNA evidence out there, seeing that we ourselves are not doing the test ourselves, can fully be relied on. But much of the DNA backs up our historical, geographical, our scriptural and archaeological evidence to maintain that the majority of the Gentiles, the so-called Gentiles, come through Canaan. And a proper and correct interpretation of the Bible that proves that the Gentiles, those who were spread abroad, and the main tribes that the Israelites had to deal with, the Hebrew Israelites coming out of Egypt, the main tribe they had to deal with, in addition to the Amalekites, you understand, who were part Canaanites and part Edomites as well, the Amalekawiyan or the Amalekites, you understand, were the Amorites or the Amuru, and we know from ancient Egypt, we see their features, or we also have color wall paintings that show us their race and their makeup, and if you can understand the hieroglyphs and interpret that, you can find out what their names were. So yes, we have the Canaanites in archaeological evidence and history as being fair skin or albino looking peoples, and if you zoom in on some of those wall paintings, you'll see that some of them even have blue eyes. But yet if you look at the fullness of the wall paintings, you can see that they all were not pale, fair, or white skin. You understand? They all were not so-called clean lepers, that some were darker skin. You understand? And we know that some of them probably were black. You understand? But the main tribes of the Canaanites, remember Canaan had 11 sons, which became 11 nations, and we can trace these 11 nations, the majority of them, down to the so-called Indo-Europeans and the so-called Caucasian or Caucasus Asians. And this is the fact. Now, because there's a handful of ones, black people, you understand, within the Palestine and Middle East, who've been living in Jordania, they really come from the Cadmonites. They would do better to admit that they are descendants of the Cadmonites, because the Cadmonites were some of the pre-Canaanite inhabitants of the land which Canaan went into. In fact, if you look at a psychological profile of Canaan based on the Metzaf Kufale, or the Book of Divisions, the Ethiopic Book of Jubilees, it basically states there that the Canaanites settled in land that was not allotted and appointed to them. In other words, they settled in land that were not their own. It's almost like the situation of the Anglo-Americans over here in America with the American Indians, that there were native people there, and they were displaced. The first displacement of the native inhabitants was by the Canaanites settling in the land that was appointed to the Beta Israel, to the Hebrews and the Ethiopian Hebrews at that. So the key operative word here when we say that the ancient Canaanites were black people, key operative word were, turned white, the majority of them, seeing that there are 11 sons, and we can go through both a DNA, you understand, genealogy of them, we can go through archaeology of them, we can go through history of them, we can go back to ancient Egypt, and we can see wall paintings of them, and the main tribes which stayed behind in that land according to the scripture and according to the evidence, were the Amuru or the Amorites, the Amorites, as well as the Yabusi, the Jebusites, which in a very, very interesting way, when we look at these two main tribes, the two main tribes that decided to stay behind, the other tribes were scattered abroad, but the two main tribes of Canaanites that stayed behind didn't just call themselves Canaanites. They called themselves by their tribal or nation affiliation. So now having a group of black folks claim to be the Canaanites, well, what tribe or what nation of the Canaan are you? And the research by different professors, so forth and so on, to prove such and such things, all fair and good, but when we put it under the microscope, we find that it's found wanting. But the two main tribes, the Jebusites, or the so-called Pale Jews, the Polish Jews, the European Jews, and the Amorites, which come down to us today as the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-Americans, the so-called British, the Spanish, and then also some of the Gergasites, who are the modern French, come down to us today as far as in this Western Hemisphere, this America and England, you understand, matrix. But then there's a link with the other Canaanites that went to Italy and displaced the native black people there. So what you have to do when you say that the Canaanites, the ancient Canaanites, were black people, you have to go into a little more detail and qualifying what you actually mean, because you're displaying that you don't understand the history of who the different peoples are. It's like saying that all the Ethiopians are Amhara, you know what I'm saying, or like saying all the Ethiopians are Tigray, or like saying all the Ethiopians are Oromo or Afan or Afar, so forth and so on. They may be called Ethiopia because that right there is the national name, but they have their particular Wagan or their particular Gosa or the particular Neged, you understand, which they are linked with. So the ancient Canaanites, yes, the ancient Canaanites were, and we say were and emphasize that word were, black people. But it's clear that the curse was a genetic curse, and part of the treatment of the Canaanawian in that land by the Hebrews, the Ethiopian Hebrews who came out of Egypt in the time of Yahushua or Joshua Yasu, was because of what the evidence that we have in the Metaphic Kufali, or the book, the Ethiopic book of Jubilees. So Aksumite Empire. This is a rebuttal and reply to Aksumite Empire and others, but in particular to Aksumite Empire. The book of Jubilees gives us a story. Do you accept this? You understand? Or do you reject this? This is very key and critical to finding out, well, where are you deriving? What evidence are we looking at? Are we looking at even the same evidence? We're going to the Ethiopic scrolls and Ethiopic scriptures like Metaphic Kufale, the book of Jubilees, the book of divisions, and we're going to books like the Metaphic Hanok, you understand, which have only been preserved in their Ethiopic, in their Tigray Amhara, in their highland form. Now, as we go into this level of teaching, we want to put a little disclaimer. We think it's necessary to put a little disclaimer as we begin to talk about what really happened to Canaan, those blacks who turned white, and what happened with the curse of Canaan and leprosy and Ham's son's disease, which curiously today they call it Hansen disease. You understand what really happened to so-called white people and the recessive genetic recessive disorder that produced so-called white from black. This is not for us to, as so-called black people, as Ethiopian and Hebrews, to glory over this, to lord this over someone because we have melanin and we're melanated. This is a divine responsibility that we have as black people, especially black people who are in the true Christ and his kingly character consciousness, the true Christ consciousness, the true messianic consciousness, especially this day and age that we're in. So we want to put a little disclaimer that this is not to gloat or to glory over the fact that white people are so-called Caucasian or Caucasus Asians. And we say this because of how this genetic disorder actually is defined. And it's so
clear. We as African people, we must remember our past, no matter how harsh, no matter how horrible, no matter how great. We must remember the good, we must remember the bad. And remember, For African people to have survived the horrors of slavery and colonialism, it doesn't testify to a weakness, it testifies to our strength.